Well, I think what we mean by hydraulic is, at its simplest, a closed system. You could, where if you push down on one part of the mechanism, necessarily another part has to go up, and that's sort of a hydraulic effect. That one action will produce another action, and one becomes descendant and the other becomes ascendant.
Yeah.
And so, as I think you and I have both thought often, that as one has a community performing its functions and institutions performing their functions, if you push down on one, the other will go up, and if you push down on the other one will go up.
Right.
And in particular, the reason that mechanism is a good metaphor, I think, is because it gives you the sense that if institutions take more functions, the result is they are pushing down on the community's capacity and increasing their own. So as community capacity goes down, institutional capacity goes up. And it's that dilemma, I think, that we've been thinking about together. You got some kind of a.
That's right. So we have a little image that we've created that begins to offer a way of seeing or visualizing this. Let's see if we can call that up. So this is an illustration of this closed system that John was talking about. So you see what John is talking about there. You have the picture of the community in the circle. And as that power of community, the functions of community begin to get lowered on one side, you see that the institution becomes elevated. So the fluid in the closed system, we think, is represented by the community functions, the functions of having a good life, so raising children, food production, that kind of thing. And in the image, what we try to show is that it's pretty clear. I think most people know now in most neighborhoods that people are not as connected as they would have been 50 years ago. So we can see that. And I think we can see the rise of institutions pretty clearly. Lots and lots of people recognize that, you know, there are working assumptions that people think that more police equal more safety and more hospitals equal more health. So there's a kind of a rise of the role of institutions. But also on the screen, there's the unseen. And that's what John and I have been trying to think a little bit about, and we want to talk and reflect on in this conversation. It's the unseen mechanism, the hydraulic relationship, where functions are appropriated, or maybe even, I suppose, one of the things that's happening in this image is that the community sometimes, due to its own sense of itself, may be outsourcing functions to the institutional world. So that's part of the dynamic too. As well as the institutions, you know, maybe appropriating. So that's an image. We don't want to stay too long on the image, but we thought it would be good to share a picture, an illustrated picture. So let's take that off screen and maybe go back to our conversation.
The thing that the hydraulic map there also shows us that while it's a closed system, most of it is unseen, not understood, and the relationship between one going up and the other going down is not clear, I think, in the minds of many people. That these things seem to be independent. That the fact that communities seem not to be as able as they used to be, have as many functions, is just unrelated to the growth of the functions in the institution. And what we're saying is that what's unseen is there's a direct relationship between the two. An example I was thinking, or maybe a couple examples, might be useful. One that has recently been called to my attention. There's a book called "Schools Can't Do It Alone," and it's a book by an educator who decided to go back in the United States and look at what new functions were given to schools since 1900. And in the book, in the appendix there, he has 85 functions that in 1900 were not in schools and that are now in schools. And over half of them used to be performed in the community by associations, families, all kinds of residential groups, the culture. So The question is the fact that schools have 85 new functions a major cause of the decline of the community to take any role in the raising of young people or education? Or does things just independent of each other? And I think what you and I have wanted to examine is the idea that one causes the other, that there's a direct relationship in that sense.
That's right.
And when you see the lists of functions that are in the book that have been transferred, you can see very clearly that there are all kinds of those functions that a well put together neighborhood or town could function. You can even imagine it, even if you've never seen it. But historically, we know that did happen. And so the question, you see this happening in many sectors of society. And another one that you hear belabored by police chiefs. Police chiefs are always saying today, the trouble is we don't have the community really involved in the issue of security and safety, as though they had nothing to do with it. But if you go back and look at their way of defining themselves and justifying increased budgets, they have consistently said, we need more money in order to deal with all these kinds of problems. And there are new problems developing, right? And as they did that, we can also see that the sense in neighborhoods that people have anything to do with being safe or secure has diminished. And they turn to the police, and the police now are turning back and saying, hey, you have a major function. In fact, it's more important what the community does to make us safe than we can ever make you safe. And big time police chiefs are saying that. So they think there's a connection.
Yes. And the more enlightened ones understand that the connection isn't just about getting the community to call the police and report on their neighbors. That it's a very clear function around the production of safety through associational life itself. And so neighborhood policing is becoming much more about community building and less about enforcement and informing. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about this idea that it's happening behind our collective backs and has been happening, for quite a number of years is take those 85 functions that families and associations and faith communities and so on and so forth quite naturally, or at least culturally, let's not say naturally, but culturally it was their way, it was part of the flow of community life. And the erosion of that through all sorts of different, I suppose, evolution of consumerism and whatnot is really interesting. But it's also interesting to think about those 85 functions falling on the shoulders of teachers and the institution and looking at the state of the educational systems in the US, all over the world, in fact. Yes. And I would say that it is clearly a crushing responsibility, which they're taking on, which they are doomed to fail at. So they're expropriating community functions, which they will fail to fulfill.
Just as the police will.
As the police will, yeah.
Yeah, I do, right?
And do, yeah. And all kinds of perversities then are created, to sort of make workarounds or figure all of this out. So this hydraulic relationship, I think, is a really, really important insight in terms of the power asymmetry, the power dynamic between institutions and communities.
One of the questions one might ask is, why did this happen? Or is there a way of understanding it as a cultural shift, which I think is possible? And one way of thinking about it is that if you went back 100 years ago when the communities were performing many of the functions, why aren't they doing it today? And one might say that a culture shift has happened. The basic idea of what society is about and who does what has shifted. And the way we see it in our lives is what we used to produce, now we go over to the institutions and buy. But the problem with that shift in culture, which is the main thing I think that has happened, is that there are just an awful lot of functions that only people face to face in relationship to each other can really perform effectively. And so you go over and you see the school getting all these new functions. And, you know, most of them are pretty poor. I call them counterfeits. They just are not the real thing, and yet they overburden the school. And if the school had a legitimate function, it's less able to do that. Exactly. So I think it's the shift to a consumer society, the idea that I could buy what I once produced.
Yeah. And it's kind of a collective equivalent of the Peter Principle, where we have elevated institutions to their own level of incompetence. And in doing so, we have handed over functions which we are most competent and most capable to perform. But so there's this very definite transfer. I think you're right. It's the consumer economy, the assumption that we can outsource these functions to the institutional world so that we can get on with being consumers, being individuals.
It's sort of, we took it out of the community and put it into the marketplace, so that this whole culture, if you look at advertising in the media these days, it's interesting to think of all of the things that are being advertised that will be done for you for money. Right? That you might have seen in the past, but people would never have thought it would be done for money. Here in where I am in Chicago, there's a pretty frequent television ad, and it's for an organization that is called A Good Place for Mom. It's the name of the organization, and what it is it's advertising constantly, right? Shaping culture.
Mm-hmm.
That what a mom is somebody who at a certain point you want to put away into a senior home. And that's a major decision, and a profession has developed. That's this company will find a good place for mom, right? And that what it's saying is that mom's good place is some place where you pay for mom to be alone. And so it seems to me, if you just look at the world of marketing and media, you can see over and over again how what you're really looking at very often is somebody try to persuade you that it's better to buy a life than it is to live one, right? And so we'll buy a life for mom.
Yeah. And that the good place is not your place, and your place is not good enough.
Yes.
So that's that critical deflation, that in order for somebody to believe that they must consume in the marketplace, which is necessarily disembedded from their community, another place, often a nowhere place, actually. So the good place is in the marketplace, and your place is not good enough. Mm-hmm. And your job, to look after mum, is to pay for that. Yes. And it's really interesting here. I'm in the Netherlands at the moment working, and I was with the mayor of a city last night and some of the aldermen, and we were. I said, help me understand the relationship between the citizens in the city here and the professionals. And we talked a little bit about that, and and they told some stories, and they said, well, essentially what we would like is we would like our residents, they call them inhabitants, we would like our residents, our inhabitants, to feel that their local government is trustworthy, and that is, that they can rely on their local government. And as they spoke, it became really clear to me that in their minds, the role of the citizen is defined as that which happens after the important work of the professionals is complete.
Yeah.
And so this is a perfect example of the hydraulic relationship. So the role of the professionals up here, the role of the citizen is down here. And I said, so in our conversation, what I want to understand is what would need to happen for that to be, because to me, that's an inversion of democracy. So what would need to happen for it to be the case that the role of the professional is what happens after the important work of the citizen is complete? And I think that's what we're talking about. So how do you, I suppose, because we are where we are, so we know that there is an elevation of the an inflation of the institutional world at the expense or the deflation of community life and culture. And people are slowly beginning to realize, my goodness, this is not a good situation to be in. So then the question, I think, becomes, how does the institutional world lead by stepping back, but relocate some of that appropriation, some of that appropriated authority and resource back into the community life again? What's your thinking on that, John?
Well, I think it is almost forced upon a lot of institutional leaders because their accountability and in your words, trustworthiness is declining. I mean, the police can see that they are, I think, generally less and less trusted. And it's too bad because they probably are doing what they can do. Mm-hmm. But there are expectations that have been created in the culture that they can do much more than that. So they reach their limits. And now the question is, can we resurrect or rise up on the community side in taking on the functions that would really begin to have more effect than the police can have? We know that the primary determinant of security and safety is the strength of the social contract in neighborhoods and towns. All kinds of research about that. In fact, there's been a major study over a decade in Chicago looking at some neighborhoods and looking at which seem to have more security and safety and which don't. And this is a Harvard professor did this study, so it must be true.
Yes, Sampson's work, isn't it, Jen? Yeah.
And he finds that the two predictors of the safest neighborhoods is how many people on the block does each person who lives there know by name? And second, how much time are they in contact outside of their house? And those are the two things that the police can't do anything about. And yet they are the greatest predictors of whether or not you and I are going to be safe. And we keep saying to the police, come on, make it safer. And the poor suckers, they're caught over there doing, I think, about what they can do. Yep. So in a sense, if we can get folks to see that our institutional people probably are at their limits, that schools are at their limits, they're over their limits, they're almost counterproductive because of all the functions we give them. And that the alternative is to say, in our neighborhood, we raise our children. And we have a supplementary activity called the school.
Yes.
And it does a piece, not a very big piece, important piece, but we're protecting the teachers so that they can do that piece that they can really do. And a part of that protection is we raise our children. Yes. We have knowledge replete in this community. If we decided we were going to be the principal educator.
There's something in there as well as, so us stepping forward and stepping into that, our own power, really, our collective cultural power, is the agreement, the social contract has to be in place where teachers and police officers have proscriptions in a sense that they say there's certain things we're not going to do. It's interesting. I was speaking to some medical practitioners here in the city on Monday, and they were making a similar point, but in relation to health that you're making around safety. And so 85% now. Some are arguing higher than 85% of what determines well-being has nothing at all got to do with clinical or pharmacological intervention or anything that a professional can do to us. So most of what counts for healing suffering happens outside of the institutional world. And the doctor I was speaking to, he's a primary care doctor, so he's a public health practitioner, but runs a primary care facility. And I said, so how many people are coming to your surgery that you would consider not to be biomedically ill? And he said 45% of the people who come into this surgery are not biomedically ill. They're lonely, they're isolated, they're disconnected in some way. Maybe they have some moderate, challenges in socializing or whatever it might be. But technically, they're not sick. They need community. They don't need a doctor. And so that's just an illustration, I think, of what we're talking about.
And a word for their condition is isolated. Isolated. They are, in a sense, alone. And so I read a book some years ago that was about the growth of loneliness in modern societies, right? Even though we're all collective, I see ourselves in cities, our loneliness is growing as we have left the more rural areas. And in Vancouver, in Canada, the foundation, the big foundation there, had a study done of what are the issues that the residents of Vancouver see are the most important in their lives. They gave them a list, an issue list of maybe 40 issues, and asked them to rate them. And the number one issue, when you show people a list of problems and say which is the greatest one in your life, is loneliness, right? Not crime, not education, not jobs, loneliness. And I think that's the personal manifestation of the loss of community competence, power, and relationships that we're talking about. And so what you're hearing about in the loneliness problem is people who are actually dependent on institutions for everything.
That's right. That's right.
And for community, nothing.
Yes.
So Canada has decided to establish a Bureau of Loneliness. I don't know whether government can cure loneliness or not.
Well, the UK had a minister for loneliness.
A minister, we're going to check out what it is that a minister for loneliness does to make people less lonely. But you and I have a friend who is in Sweden, who's the manager of a large housing development, 6,000 people. And somebody told him that one of the big problems there was a lot of people were lonely. And our friend is a very creative person, and almost unbelievably, he had a little sheet of paper posted all around the place saying, "Are you lonely? If you are, come next Tuesday to the dining room and we'll have lunch together," right? And 80-some people show up for lunch, right? Self-declared lonely people. and yet that, on his part, seems to be precipitated the greatest possibility of dealing with their problem that one could imagine, right? But he's an institutional leader, but he precipitated relationships. And that seems to be very inventive, something that we talk with public officials or agency people. Maybe we could get them to think more about how can you be a precipitant rather than an intervener.
Yes, because I think what we're seeing is now the rise of programmatic interventions around loneliness. So loneliness has now become the new pathology that they're targeting with programs. And I think it was different with our friend Thomas, is that he was able to make that invitation because he had supported community builders and community building in the neighborhood. And so there were all of these connectors who were also going to be at that lunch and were welcomers and askers in the neighborhood. So I think that whole question of deinstitutionalization, and it's again the hydraulic relationship. You see this time and time again, even in my own career, as I moved away from working with big institutions to moving into more community work. It was pretty clear to me in the 90s that I was looking around in Europe and different parts of the world, hearing a lot of people. I mean, this goes right back to the 50s and whatever, but in my career, people were talking about deinstitutionalizing people with disabilities and mental health issues. But what I loved about our friend Thomas's work is he was busy trying to recommunalize. He was busy trying to build the community. And it's that hydraulic relationship. I wonder whether, and you have more of a historic sense of this, Jan, so I'd be interested in your thinking on this, whether what has happened historically is we've done a lot of deinstitutionalizing of labeled people, but very little on the community building side, you know, so we've reduced this, but in a sense, because we haven't built a community alternative, another institution, just a little bit smaller, has popped up in the place of the,
I would say historically, there are a set of people, and they are professionals, who really have recognized that the problem isn't deinstitutionalization, it is recommunalization, and who have dedicated themselves to working within whatever setting they are to trying to provide an opportunity, a doorway into community life, rather than thinking about it of dumping somebody out of an institution. And I think they've had some significant effects, and they're trailblazers. Incidentally, for people who would be interested in this, they get together, the leaders, the people who are at the forefront, every summer in Toronto, in Canada. People come from all around the world who are interested in the recommunalization process. And anybody who wanted to could go to the internet and look at the Toronto Summer Institute, find out. I think it's this July, and it's one of the most inspiring experiences I have, because people are walking with people who've been institutional captives out, and then creating an inviting situation for them, and then stepping back.
One of the examples of an institution that has reduced and deflated itself to intentionally inflate communalization that I've seen recently was in Cincinnati, the Star Fire. This is just a wonderful example in my mind. So what would have been a classic workshop placement, I guess, for people with intellectual disabilities, very, very large physical facility where people from different neighborhoods and the surrounding parts of Cincinnati would come with intellectual disabilities and do workshop, maybe learn a skill, whatever it might be. But largely they were in this facility and they were supported by paid people within the facility. And a friend of ours decided this is not a good life, with the support of some parents and some local activists, but also with willing staff, began to try to reimagine with the participants what a good life would look like. And of course, what people wanted was they wanted friends and connections and neighborliness. So I'm shorthanding a little bit, but today, if you go there, what you will see is you'll see an enterprise space where local businesses, small businesses, are able to establish little pop-up offices where they operate from, and they pay some rent. But what you'll also notice if you spend time is that the participants are now out in their own neighborhoods with resource money that they can spend in their neighborhoods as community builders, building up the neighborhood and investing in all kinds of community building and recommunalizing activities. So effectively, they've gone from being needy, labeled people who have only got relationship with salaried strangers to the people that are needed in their neighborhood with resource, going out into that neighborhood as community builders, and the staff that are supporting them are co-community builders. So they're out in the neighborhoods with them, supporting relationship building. I just think it's a wonderful example of deinstitutionalization. He was decommissioning the service. But over your career, John, you've been with them, journeyed with many leaders who have been precipitators of recommunalization. I think of Jerry Miller and Henry Moore, and who are the people that you've been inspired by and you think are good exemplars of what we're talking about here?
Well, you certainly named a couple right off. Henry Moore was the assistant city manager of Savannah, Georgia, who sent a letter to the people in the lowest income neighborhood in the city, about a quarter of the city. The letter said, here in the city, we haven't been very good at supporting you in all the good work that you want to do, right? He's starting with a presumption, right, that citizens are the doers, not us, right? And so he said, write us a letter, no more than one page, that says what you would like to do to improve your block this summer. And we'd like you to sign it, have two other people who will do it. These two other people will do it with you. It could even be a church or a block club. And then tell us if you need any money to do it. And the maximum that they said he could give in money was $100. And Henry told me, he said, want to make sure you don't give very much money. He said, because the money has to be the bait. It's not the fish. we're baiting citizens to become productive in building the life in their own community. Well, the first year he got 80 requests, right? And, very little money was spent. People say, we want to make a flag for every household, and here's the cost of the flag material, and we need the 32 skeins of red thread, and for a total of $76.31. And so they have built out from that kind of a discovery process a neighborhood which has improved in so many ways. And it was a neighborhood because of low income where big money had been put in from the top. We call them block grants, right? Mm-hmm. And Henry said, I was King Henry when I had the block grants and I made almost no change. But when I led by stepping back and provided the incentive for citizens to be producers, things changed. And I think that is, from an institutional point of view, one of the most incredible ways of beginning to change the hydraulics. Yeah. Right? He was saying, you have all kinds of functions you can perform. How do we support you? We're not the doer. You're the doer. So there are a good many.
I think so.
Wonderful. And
wonderful. Thank you.
Doing it again, and especially hearing, if people hear this, thoughts they have and other things they think would be worth having discussed.
Absolutely. We're absolutely hungry to hear from other people and learn with other people. These are open conversations, and we're just searching, always searching. So we want to hear your thoughts. We're going to create a blog. I think the younger people who know more about this tell me it's not a blog, it's a vlog, a video and a blog. So we'll do that, and there'll be space to comment and contact us. And we'll make sure we put these lists of links that we've mentioned in as well. And we're going to try and have some more conversations together about different subjects. So welcome, everybody. Welcome in. We want to hear your thoughts and learn with you. And that's it for now. Go well.
May you have a satisfying day.
Indeed.